Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for taking the time to be here with us. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're gathered tonight across the country, wherever you are. I'd like to take a moment to pay respects to your elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm Joel Lindsay. I'm the National VP of the United Nations Association of Australia Young Professionals. That is a mouthful. We just call ourselves the UNAA YPs, or the YPs for short. Tonight, we're bringing you three excellent speakers, two former Assistant Secretaries-General of the UN, and one future Secretary-General, I'm sure, and we'll be engaging in some polite debate on issues of critical importance for Australia and the world. And then we're going to get your questions posed to our speakers. But by way of brief introduction, we have Gillian Triggs and Ramesh Thakur with us here tonight. So thank you both for taking the time. Gillian is an emeritus professor, former president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and was appointed in 2019 as an Assistant Secretary-General and Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So incredibly well-experienced and impressive CV behind that three-line snippet. Ramesh Thakur, I'm not just repeating myself, is also an emeritus professor, the former director of the Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, one of the main authors of the R2P. So international relations law students out there have doing a lot of work on R2P. Ramesh is one of the authors. He's also a former Assistant Secretary-General of the United Nations. But kicking us off with her provocation that not everything is going swimmingly in the world of international relations is Lily Dewan. Lily is a fifth-year law student, fifth-year law and justice student, National Comms Officer for UNAA YP, and I'm sure a future Secretary-General of the UN herself. So Lily will open us up with the provocation of what's going wrong in the world, and then we're going to turn to Ramesh and Gillian in turn to talk to us about their story, their history, their thoughts on the issues, to rebut Lily's negativity and give us some hope with some guidance, obviously. And then we're going to delve into the intricacies of the issue, including your questions. So without further ado, Lily, let's take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Joel, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. So, from matters of trade to climate change to security to migration, today's world is increasingly interconnected. Multilateralism is indispensable in addressing these global climate challenges, and yet despite its necessity today, and the evolving geopolitical landscape, the institutions that are designed to facilitate multilateralism are under strain. As Joel said, what follows will be three broad criticisms of the UN and multilateralism that are dominant in both the media and the public's mind. So the first is that the UN is failing. So the veto power of the UN Security Council and the permanent five countries, so France, the UK, China, and Russia, has been a long-standing criticism of the UN. The veto power often results in ideologically driven deadlocks, which presents swift and substantive action. Due to this, the UN has been generally slow to respond to humanitarian crises. The Security Council's structural inability to resolve superpower-centered conflicts is evident in its limited action in Ukraine. This reflects the gap between the UN's universal aspirations and its hierarchical reality. The veto power contradicts the notion that sovereign equality exists between the UN and nation states. Despite the evolving nature of geopolitics, the structure of the UN has remained largely unchanged. There is an unequal influence of wealthy nations and a clear Western lean. A further criticism is that the UN has limited means of enforcement. States have taken multilateral military action, ignored resolutions, and disregarded human rights. The second that is also prominent is that international law is a fallacy. The absence of a centralized enforcement body and the strength of power politics undermine the egalitarian purposes of international legal order, making UN a theory or extension of politics only. The world watches as missiles fire, but the responses of humanitarian bodies like the UN are materially inconsistent. Whilst international obligations remained intact, the practical protection of those in need is slow and fracturing. International law enforcement has been criticised for being disproportionate. Powerful states have the resources and leverage to ignore international law with little consequences, while smaller states cannot withstand the economic consequences of non-compliance. The ICJ's jurisdictional basis of consent gives states significant power. They can decide to what extent they wish to submit to the ICJ's jurisdiction. Restricted enforcement is a significant challenge of opt-in institutions like the UN and ICJ. For example, nations that have not ratified or have since withdrawn their support of the Rome Statute are not members of the ICC. The inability to compel state cooperation makes it unclear how senior government figures can be prosecuted and how civilian protection can be administrative. The third is that without meaningful superpower negotiation, the actions of small and middle power countries are irrelevant. On global issues such as climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, public health, refugee protection, and the delivery of humanitarian aid, critics argue that countries like the US and China possess the economic, technological, military, and political influence required to seek substantive change. Take nuclear non-proliferation, for example. Smaller countries may ratify treaties banning nuclear weapons, but complete non-proliferation cannot occur until the nine nuclear-armed nations disarm. In global health crises, the largest states control much of the world's vaccine production, medical research, and funding. Therefore, international health campaigns often depend on superpower leadership and resources. Consequently, the progress of global challenges ultimately depend on the willingness of superpowers to lead, cooperate, and commit resources, making smaller states secondary actors in international affairs. So that's a brief overview of the main challenges facing the UN and multilateralism. I'm going to hand it over to Ramesh. Would you like to start with your responses to these three broad challenges?
Thanks, Lily. I'm sure we'll come back to them in response to specific questions. Initially, I prefer to phrase my introductory remarks, in a broader sense. And I've tentatively titled it that realism and idealism, or if you like, idealism within realism, is better than realism versus idealism. And in many ways, all your provocations fall into the trap of contrasting realism with idealism. Now, I'll do that in three sets of remarks. First, the United Nations is a site where realism meets and sometimes collides with idealism. Idealism needs to be disciplined by realism, to be connected to the needs, constraints, and material assets that determine both the potential but also the limits of what can be done to translate vision into policy. A refusal to temper principle with pragmatism, I think, confuses moral absolutism for moral courage, for the United Nations as much as for states. Equally, however, a refusal to infuse realism with idealistic principles robs it of moral compass to provide ballast and robs it of humanity to give it purpose. Now, there's a lovely story from the second Secretary-General, Dag Hammarskjöld, who remains, in my estimation, the best SG we've ever had. When in a crisis in which he and the UN largely opposed actions that were being done by the Western powers, that may have been Britain and France, but may also have included the United States. And the Security Council was in session, and Hammarskjöld spelled out why he thought those actions were contrary to UN Charter principles and values and clauses. And at the end of that, as he was walking out, the British ambassador went to him in the corridors and tried to get him to moderate his views. And Hammarskjöld listened politely, but said he would stand by what he had said. At which point the ambassador said, "Mr. Secretary-General, there is such a thing as political reality." To which Hammarskjöld famously said, "Yes, Excellency, and there is such a thing as integrity." And that is important. It's almost impossible to imagine a Secretary-General today saying that. And so on the first heading, the normative settling point of the architecture of international order oscillates along the continuum between power-based realism and principles-based idealism as the two endpoints. So that's the first point. The second point to remember is when we talk of the UN, there are actually three separate, if connected, United Nations. There is the United Nations of the Secretariat and the mini-secretariats of the system spread worldwide, including UNSCR in Geneva and its officials. That's the first one. The second UN is member states and their national delegates. And then there's the third UN of NGOs, insiders, outsiders, UNAs, around the world, etc. And a lot of the criticism confuses the three. For example, a criticism, how is it possible for Iran to be elected to the Human Rights Council? Why does the UN permit that? Well, on that decision, no UN official has a vote, not even the Secretary-General. That is the decision for the member states. And a lot of the Security Council decisions similarly. Yes, it is in the name and on behalf of the United Nations, but again, no UN official has a vote. Now, of course, the Secretary-General has avenues of influence and can shape the debate and can raise the agenda, issues on the agenda, but it's the member states. And there are other areas where it's not the member states, but UN officials. So we need to remember that. And third, and for the initial remarks, most importantly, I think you have to separate the United Nations as an organization, as a concrete organization with structures, with personnel, with decisions that is trying to implement on the one side, and the United Nations as an idea, as a project on behalf of humanity, as a symbol. Now, the establishment of the United Nations was a small but symbolically important step on the journey to tame the use of aggressive, unlawful, and unjustified force as a means of settling quarrels among different members of the human family scattered across the globe. If you think long term, as you should in international history, from the Concert of Europe onwards for the last few centuries, we actually have come a very long way in outlawing war and the means of war and imposing normative constraints and trying to hold countries and leaders and commanders accountable. We haven't got where we want to get to, but we have come a long way. We shouldn't forget that. And the incidence of international violence has generally retreated. In addition, it also exists to promote and facilitate cooperation on shared objectives and common goals. And in this sense, it remains our one and best hope for unity and diversity in a world in which global problems require multilateral solutions. And in that sense, it is the embodiment of the international community and the custodian of world conscience. So it represents the idea that unbridled nationalism and the raw interplay of power must be mediated and moderated in an international framework. Thus, it is the center for harmonizing national interests and forging this elusive international interest. Now, of course, the United Nations is also an international bureaucracy with many failings and flaws, and a forum often used and abused by governments for finger pointing, not problem solving. There is a proclivity in UN circles to seek fresh legislation in the form of another resolution as the solution to problems of implementation. And you mentioned compliance is a major, that's a problem of implementation. You don't solve that by another resolution. Too often, I think the United Nations has demonstrated a failure to tackle urgent collective action problems due to institutionalized incapacity or unwillingness. These are the three facets, and I think you covered all three really in your provocation: an international bureaucracy, a politician's talk shop, and a spineless, toothless cop on the beat that oftentimes have drawn the most serious criticism, much of it, I would say, warranted. Not all of it, but much of it. And yet, the world body remains the focus of international expectations and the locus of collective action. The reason for this, and this is the message I would like to leave with the audience, the reason for this is that much more than the attributes of bureaucratic rigidity, institutional timidity, and intergovernmental trench warfare, the United Nations is the one and only body that houses the divided fragments of humanity. It is an idea, a symbol of an imagined and constructed community of strangers. It exists to bring about a world where fear is changed to hope, want gives way to dignity, and apprehensions are turned into aspirations. In the words of the illustrious Secretary-General Hammarskjöld, whom I referred to earlier, the United Nations was, quote, not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell, unquote. To which I would add, the concept of hell has no real meaning without the twin concept of heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. That was very informative. Gillian, I'll pass it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. And I've really been very fortunate in being the third speaker to hear Lily's provocation, which I think in a way represents, if I may say so, the Gen Z view of the international structure through the United Nations and the failure they would see of the rule of law. Of course, mentioning as she has every right to, the lack of enforcement for wrongs, the imbalance of power amongst states. So thank you. I think you've really set out what I think so many people, young people in particular, have been so disappointed by in this environment at the moment, where we see probably more conflicts than we've seen since the end of the Second World War. So young people questioning and querying what is the future of the United Nations and the instruments of the UN and the rule of law. What on earth is the point when it's manifestly failing in the primary role of the UN Charter and the protection of territorial integrity, etc. So thank you for that. But Ramesh, also wonderful to have your introduction. Thank you. And the language that I like to use, which is really very similar to yours in a sense, and that is the concept of principled pragmatism. And that I have learned in my job as Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees over the last nearly 5 years. The United Nations it's an inspirational idea. And it has all of the assets and inspiration that Ramesh has pointed out, and I agree with everything he said. But my job showed me that the UN is extremely successful in many of the areas in which it is able to act as a pragmatic matter of achieving outcomes in the interests of humanity. And of course, from the perspective of refugees, which was my field, we had to take incremental changes whenever we could. And perhaps if I could just give you a very practical example of that. When I was in an African country, in the Sahel, Zambia, I was very privileged, and one is in these positions within the UN, to meet with the president. And I was there. He courteously listened to me talk about the horrific circumstances of refugees who'd been in the country, hosted by that country for many years, but not able to get to work, their children not able to get an education or to go to university. Now, this is contrary to the Refugee Convention, a 1951 treaty, fundamental really to post-war peace and security efforts and humanitarian efforts. And as I say, he listened courteously, but then said, "But Gillian, you have to understand the position that this country is in. We are poor. We strive for democracy. We have Boko Haram on our borders. We have slaughtering of people in our villages. We have refugees continuing to pour in our country over decades and now in the current environment. We will do for refugees what we reasonably can. But you cannot come here from the UN and Geneva with the millions that we brought, it must be said, and capacities to help. We cannot be driven by the very high standards of the Refugee Convention itself, one of the finest, I think, treaties produced at the end of the Second World War." And he didn't make any commitment at the time, but what I particularly pleaded for was the right of primary school children as refugees to be able to go to school, because their lives would have very little hope without it. And within a week or so of leaving, the president came back to say that from now on it was possible for those children to go to school, and that he would ensure that the law was changed, and he did. Now, there are many examples of that kind, particularly in Africa, but in parts of Asia, in the Middle East, where the UN officials, and particularly, if I may say so, in the humanitarian area, are constantly battling with the need to find a pragmatic answer, even though as a lawyer, I would want to speak about the rule of law, which was very technical and detailed provisions and very important provisions of the Refugee Convention itself. How much don't give up, but how much can you persuade a political leader to agree to. So principled pragmatism, I think, was something that I really clung on to with the relatively few gains that we were able to achieve in a very difficult period. Another point that I think needs to be made very, very clear is that the United Nations is a member-based organization. As Ramesh has pointed out, the officials of the organization must do what is required of them or permitted by the member states, so that how we spent our budget, how we collected our budget from donations, from assessments in relation to particular member states, all of this depended on the annual approval of the member states who came along to the meetings in Geneva every year or in New York. And so, although there's a tendency to blame the UN as some sort of entity that operates autonomously, it does not, in fact, operate autonomously. It must bring the member states with them. Most important of them, of course, being the veto states, the permanent representatives. Now, you might look at that structure agreed in 1945 and say, well, this was a structure bound to fail. If you had certain powerful states always able to veto the primary provisions in relation to use of force and to enforcement of international law where possible, then what hope did it have? Well, I think it's fair to say that in the 80 years since the UN Charter, the member states and all those that have worked with those member states through the UN have achieved a great deal. And one is the creation of a body of law, which for the most part has been effective. And if I can quote that wonderful lawyer, Professor Henkin, most states abide by international law, and that's treaties, norms, and so on, most of the time. Now, they do so not for a sentimental reason, if they had one, but it's because they know that there are mutual advantages to be gained from abiding by the principles of international law. Now, when I give you examples of that, you'll be a bit bored. It might be the Universal Postal Union. It might be intellectual property protection. It's the Law of the Sea Treaty and the massive agreement by the international community on the rules relating to the use of the sea, the World Trade Organization, all of the agencies, the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, of course, the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the treaties on human rights, genocide, torture, the protection of women and children, aged people, and etc. What has happened since that massive period of lawmaking in the 20th century is that we've seen a decline in respect for many of these treaties in the last few years. And that is something that I think the next generation really has to contend with. How do we cling or maintain those ideas that Ramesh has put forward to ensure that we facilitate cooperation, but we recognize that it's a practical environment that we're dealing with, and we have to we make incremental gains. We are in a particularly difficult time with the violations of that fundamental obligation of the United Nations, the international peacekeeping, where we have this what the Pope Francis declared was in fact a form of fractured third world globally. We also have the Prime Minister of Canada saying that the international rule of law is dead. Well, I think those are gloomy points of view, and they're not ones that will, I think, survive. We are going through a particularly difficult time where the primary purpose of the UN is demonstrably not able to function. The UN Security Council is largely sidelined from most of the international conflicts that we're looking at the moment, and the world is looking on in horror, and particularly the younger generation. But we will get past this phase, and we will probably have to find new approaches to strengthening the United Nations organizations in the future, whatever form that takes. And there are many efforts at reform that in turn, that can be blocked through the veto powers, I'm sure you all know. But I'd like to finish with just one example that I think is an important one, but perhaps not understood or known about particularly, and that is the extraordinary revival of the role of the International Court of Justice. Lily has pointed out, one of the difficulties is enforcement of the rule of law. Obviously, that's true in the area of conflict affecting vital national interests, particularly resources. But if we look at other areas of law, the court has really flourished in the last few years, where more and more countries are resorting to the courts, whether it's questions of genocide, war crimes, or which would go hopefully to the International Criminal Court. But we've seen a revival of interest, or a creation of interest maybe at the international level, to find ways of using the legal resources more effectively. And last year, we had a remarkable decision by the International Court of Justice holding states responsible for actions which have led to climate change. Now, that's a very brief description of that very important decision, but it's a crucial one. But I thought I'd point out that how that case got to the International Court of Justice was through the stimulation of students in the Pacific region, the Pacific universities. They had come together and said, surely there must be some way of holding states responsible for meeting climate change obligations. And that was taken up ultimately by the Pacific nations, and ultimately then by the General Assembly, with a referral to the International Court of Justice and a quite a revolutionary determination by that court. So let me finish by saying I think that is the future when we get past this phase that we're in at the moment, if I can put it that way. Maintaining principled pragmatism, we will find a much greater emphasis on local communities, on civil society, on the business community, the roles of the development bank, but particularly, if I may say so and come back to Lily, young people being willing to take these initiatives and to use the law in a positive way. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's nice to hear from those who have worked in and around this system that it is a phase. I think those Gen Z, like myself, we have seen this development, like post 9/11 of, oh, this was the old time, this is the new time, what is happening now? Whereas this like de-escalation. And so it's nice to hear that, yeah, it's about principled pragmatism and it's a phase. And there's those grassroots organizations and students and young professionals like those in our community who can take on those challenges and really move forward. So I think we've discussed the shift in the work post World War order, and I think ultimately the message that comes from both of your speeches is that the UN is up to the task of global development. I think that we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's that element of the ideology, and then also the practicalities. So I want to start, in your opinion, we've had League of Nations previously, evolution has occurred. What elements of the UN can be made more robust to make it better at enforcing this new world order?
Gillian, you can go first on this one.
Well, there are, of course, very strong initiatives within the United Nations system itself, backed by wider communities, with a pact for reform. But when one reads the list of things that will be subject to that reform, it really is very much a list of things that we've been trying to do for a long time. And I won't go through them all, but they concern management of the digital world for the future, efforts at much greater inclusion, but particularly reform through the Security Council by including more particularly populous states. That we really have to recognize that the world does not look the way it did in 1945. We now, at that time, I think, 51 states ultimately signed up to the Charter. We now have 193. That world has changed dramatically. And I think most people talking of reform in the United Nations through the Charter is to increase the membership of the Security Council itself, so that it's more inclusive and it reflects that world of big countries, India, obviously, Indonesia, Brazil, but many other countries would come to mind. How we do that, I'm not sure, but we elect others in addition to the permanent members, and one imagines that we can come up with a solution to do that. And I think that would be a healthy thing. Can we reform the veto? Extremely difficult when the veto can veto the reform. You're going around in circles, but it might be possible to constrain the use of the veto so that it's not and cannot be used in really egregious, for example, human rights abuses, humanitarian needs, emergencies, and egregious breaches of the fundamental principles of the Charter, being invasions of territorial sovereignty and so on. There are ways of doing this. Whether they are politically possible remains very much to be seen. So I think that reform is on the table. The Secretary-General, of course, has a huge financial threat to the future of the United Nations system, and we haven't mentioned that so far. But he has said that the loss of income and loss of assessment payments being paid to the United Nations is an existential threat to the United Nations itself. And my own experience of that is true. The major specialist agencies of the United Nations are being decimated by the loss of funding. That's partly, of course, the United States, but it's also other countries are significantly reducing their support, and I think that's a very real challenge. So there are various other elements, but I think we can reform. There are mechanisms for reform, but it's complex and it involves a lot of issues, but most particularly more inclusive of other states and more inclusive of civil society, the business community, working with the other agencies and other international organizations in order to achieve the grand idea of the United Nations Charter after 1945.
Thank you. Come to you, Ramesh. Joel mentioned your. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, do you want to add to that?
I do, and I take a slightly different perspective. So it's important. I do. Let me start with an actual event and then work up to the general principles. In 2015, we meaning the world, negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran. That was a 5+1 agreement, all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. Or you can do it 3 and 3 in terms of the European Union. In the various ways you can slice it, but it was a multilaterally negotiated deal with the full and active participation, if not leadership, by the United States. In fact, it was under US leadership. That deal was signed by all the countries. It was then taken to the Security Council. In July 2015, if I remember rightly, it was unanimously endorsed by the Security Council. It was a robust deal, which dismantled, people forget, it actually dismantled 98% of the low enriched uranium that Iran had accumulated. It completely cut off their plutonium pathway to the bomb and severely restricted the uranium pathway by limiting purification, enrichment of uranium to 3.67%. A point at which we have no weaponization worries about it at all. And it had unprecedented international inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Okay? The IAEA repeatedly certified that Iran was in compliance with that agreement. Despite that, in 2018, President Trump, in his first administration, unilaterally pulled out of that and scuppered it. So it's the United States that was in material breach of that treaty. Now, can you have the United Nations take enforcement action against the United States? Of course not, because you launch a world war and you lose. And now, President Trump, having gone further in joining Israel in an illegal war attack on Iran, which he thought would only last a few days, perhaps a few weeks, and now we are coming to the end of the 3rd month, is desperately seeking a way out. Strait of Hormuz needs to be opened. Well, it was open before he started the war. And he's seeking what essentially will be a nuclear agreement light in terms of what we had in 2015, which was actually very powerful and robust and worked. Start with that because you have a fundamental problem. The Security Council and therefore the United Nations cannot take enforcement action against the powerful countries. We haven't succeeded in taking enforcement action even against North Korea. Forget about that. On the same issue, forget about the United States. Then you go to the general principles from that. The point of the United Nations when it comes to enforcement action and outlawing the use of force, the idea is when the major powers are in agreement, then the United Nations can act. So at the end of the Cold War, when the rivalry between Moscow and Washington ends, they then cooperate to bring the long-running and very bitter Iran-Iraq war to an end. But as long as they had rival clients and backed their respective clients, you couldn't do it. And then you cooperate on other things. The reason I wanted to start with that is the primary function of the United Nations is maintenance of international peace and security. The only organ that can do that is the Security Council. That action is hostage to P5 agreement. That reflects the world of 1945. It is out of date. That is the central, most important reform. That aspect covers every other activity by the United Nations, including decisions of the CJ. Ultimately, they're enforceable only by the Security Council, and therefore they're subject to great power politics and veto. So if you make the UN more powerful now, you are increasing the power of the great powers over the smaller states. On top of that, the permanent membership is heavily skewed towards the Western countries. So you exempt the major powers, the great powers with a veto, and you take enforcement action against the others. That is reversing the idea that the purpose of the United Nations is to tame the exercise of power in world affairs. And by now, a lot of other reforms have become an alibi and an excuse for not tackling the most central thing. So is there a way around that, where you can continue with other reforms, but you have to address the major central one first? And I'm glad you mentioned, Lily, at the start of your remarks, the League of Nations. If you think about it, structurally and in operations, in most important respects, the United Nations is essentially a continuation of the League of Nations. But for good political reasons, we changed the name. We carried over good parts. We learned from experience and codified those into new charter clauses, and we abandoned obsolete or bad parts. One of the improvements was, in fact, a continued democratization of the council, because under the league system, every member of the council, even the elected members, had a veto. Under UN, we don't. But the reason I say that is I think in practice, we can stay on this reform path forever. The Security Council is not reformable. Gillian mentioned the difficulty of the veto. There is a second difficulty. Not only must you add new permanent members, you must have the courage to identify and get rid of those that no longer deserve to be there. On what basis today should the United Kingdom and France be veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council? And therefore, the solution, I think, if you're really serious about preserving the ethos and the ideal of a United Nations, but overcoming the dysfunctionality which pervades more and more, the only solution is, in my opinion, to convene another new international conference to set up United Nations 2.0. And if we don't do that, and I said this 20 years ago, just as I was leaving the UN, if we don't do that, the United Nations will find itself year by year becoming increasingly marginalized and irrelevant. And I'm afraid that has happened in the 20 years since. The second and final point, which is also important, is I think we have to recognize the growing discontent against what is perceived by increasing segments of the population in many countries as overreach by technocratic globalists. And the focus is now on reasserting national identity and national control. And the reaction against that, the people feel their own governments no longer listen to them and collaborate with internationalists. And you cannot understand the rise of populist movements if we don't come to terms with this. So I think we need to be careful of that as well. And it seems to me we spend a lot of time tinkering on the margins and running away from what is the most important, because it is a very complex and difficult issue. But until we do that, I think we'll still be on the same pathway.
Can I quickly jump in and be cheeky and ask a follow-up, Ramesh? Because you raised some awesome points there, back to back. But one that caught my attention was you mentioned, why should UK and France have a permanent veto power on the Security Council? Do you think then, and I want to go to Gillian as well, but do you quickly think that there needs to remain anybody with the permanent veto? Because that is the crux of the fairness question. Why should anybody in the one state, one vote system in the General Assembly especially have a veto? And in your UN 2.0, is there any role for anybody having a permanent, entrenched power over another state as a bigger state for whatever reason?
I would answer positively on both. I think we should get rid of the permanent membership category and have two classes. One is either a 10 or 15-year term, renewable. And the second is make it at least a 2 veto requirement rather than thing, and make it possible to overcome that depending on the size of the council. If you have the 2/3 or 3/4 majority vote following a veto, then the veto should be possible to be overruled. So if you do these two, you'll get rid of a lot of the angst and you'll be able to do much more through that system. The practical difficulties will remain, and that basic tension on, do you want to feel good or do you want to do good? That issue will always be there. But at least there will be a way forward, and you're much more likely to get buy-in from the smaller states and the weaker states and the poorer states if there is that effort at equitable balance, not just of decision-making authority, but of enforceability of UN decisions.
I think we come back really to what I think are political realities. It's going to be extremely difficult to reform the veto vote position in the Security Council. It's simply not realistic.
I think it's impossible, yeah.
So I thoroughly agree with you on that point. I too have rather dreamt of the idea that you simply move to create a different organization, which is rather attractive if it were to be possible. And let me give you an example of what has already happened, and it's really quite fascinating. You may all be aware that in 2018, the Trump administration withdrew from the World Trade Organization's appellate processes with the technique of refusing to appoint arbitral judges to that tribunal. And what he succeeded in doing as the months rolled on was that all of those panel matters over trade issues could not go on appeal to the appellate body because there were no judges appointed or not enough for that tribunal. Now, that appeared to bring the whole enforcement process of the WTO to a grinding halt. But what happened? 47 countries, including Australia, agreed that the appellate process for enforcement of the trade rules under the WTO was so important that they had to create a new informal body, which is what they've done. So they did it among themselves. It was a workaround, if you want to use that phrase, but I'm seeing workarounds everywhere. And I think we're going to continue to see it. New geopolitical groupings of states, strange bedfellows, countries trading in ways that they'd not done before. We are seeing all sorts of ways in which the attempt through the Trump administration to stymie the work of such an important body as the World Trade Organization, and a relatively successful one, could be avoided by maintaining this appellate process. Now, I won't go into that example any further. It's quite technical, but it's been quite an interesting example that the states who care about the rule of law, powerful and not so powerful, can come together and to create a new semi-entity to achieve what they see as the mutual value of enforcing the principles of the World Trade Organization. Now, maybe dreaming big, it will be possible to do the same thing in relation to the reform process, that we will never be able to reform the UN itself, and we will have a parallel organization. And we know that, of course, Mr. Trump is doing the same thing. He's established his own added peace board, I think, with some dubious members nonetheless. the point is that this is what's happening there, whether it's the Trump administration looking at new ways, but the rest of us can do it as well. And we're seeing that in Europe, we're seeing it in Asia operating differently always, and the middle powers finding other solutions. So I think these are of course interesting times. I think there are ways through, and I think we're going to see strengthening of other economies. One thing that I think rather supports Lily's point and worries me a great deal, because there's a great deal of discussion, of course, about reinvigorating democracy. When the 51 states signed the charter in 45, there was, I think, a general agreement that there was a move towards maintaining and ensuring the fundamental principles of democracy. Today, of 193 member states of the UN, only 26 are classified as full democracies. Most are failing democracies and moving all the way across the spectrum to autocracies. And I think that is also one of the many threats to the future of the United Nations, because we're dealing with governments that simply don't abide by the underlying values reflected in the language of the Charter, but the underlying values based on a principle of democracy. And that is why I think among the many initiatives that we all need to take, it is to strengthen much more vocally, much more effectively, the underlying principles of democracy. And I can say that that's true for Australia as well.
Just two quick confirmation of your point about the workaround, Gillian, from my field. One is the Ottawa Treaty on anti-personnel landmines, which we went around the UN system, around the continent, with Canada and Norway in particular, and Austria taking the lead. And the second one, of course, is more recently in 2017, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which was taken up directly by the General Assembly and approved. So there are two good examples exactly of that effort to work around the blockages in the existing structure.
That's right. Yes, I think we will see many more of those exercises as they become somewhat successful in the field. We'll see more efforts by countries, whether it's the EU coming together more effectively than they have done in the past, and acknowledging that some of the Trump criticisms have been quite valid, and it's been one of the elements that's been exposed by the US president, that the United States has been relied on for far too long to support the whole UN structure, and it has done. And I should say that from my perspective within the UN Refugee Agency, it's the United States that has supported and maintained that organization from the very beginning. Without that funding and with its flag bearing for democracy, however one might criticize that as being a very sort of Western approach, and certainly has been, the fact is that to deliver, and if it's about outcomes that we're interested in, humanitarian outcomes, to deliver those outcomes, the United States has been the global supporter, not only ideologically, politically, but financially. And of course, when we hear, of course, the criticisms he's made of the UN and withdrawing the funding, it's been disastrous. The way in which he's gone about it has been disastrous. But he had some very good points to make, and we should have moved earlier to find and encourage other states to step up. And I say that in my own role within UNHCR, that other states really got away with playing very little supportive role for the refugee regime, paid very little to support it, and are now, of course, very quick to criticize the United States. So it's a complex situation that's gone badly wrong.
Yep. Incredible. Me and Lily had an order of questions I'm going to be rude and butt in, because you both created such a perfect segue to try and weave in one of our guest questions. Incredible careers. You both touched on incredible work you've done at the highest levels of UN and international government. Taking a step back, I'm hoping you could, if briefly, give us a bit of a highlight reel of, where you went to get from where you started to, what a lot of people in this call would aspire to one day be, pie in the sky thinking, working in the heads of UN agencies, how you got to where you were, and weaving in that theme that you're talking about of workarounds, talking about some of your experiences. A question from James. Yes, James. Give us a bit of a highlight of what your day-to-day work was like for the UN as assistant and secretaries, and how you went around sort of like getting consensus, working with people, and as you both mentioned, finding these workarounds that sort of get stuff done in the morass of the international bureaucracy. So maybe Ramesh first, a bit of a brief summary of like how you got there and what you did at the top.
Sure. How I got into the system, especially at that level of seniority, is a good news story about the UN system. I did not know anyone in the UN system. I saw a vacancy, applied for it, was shortlisted, interviewed, offered the job, and accepted. None of my referees were UN officials. I didn't ask any government to lobby on my behalf. I went straight in. Now, they might have well made a mistake, but at least the decision was made on application, merits, interview, etc. There was no lobbying, no back channels, nothing whatsoever. While I was with the UN University, for the 9 years, I actually chaired our appointments board. We had 14 institutes around the world, the equivalent of faculties in a traditional university. And I can tell you, in those 9 years, the people I appointed as directors of the institute, or in fact at any level, both those I appointed and certainly everyone that I signed off on, I had not known a single one of those people from before personally. So we operated on that principle. So this idea that the entire system is corrupt is false. No qualification in my saying that. There are parts of the system that are inefficient. There are parts that are incompetent. There are parts that are nepotistic. But not all of us had to compromise on our bottom line ideals, one. Two, in terms of if I look back and what I think were my proudest achievements and efforts, on learning experience, the most memorable for me was being the principal writer for Kofi Annan's second reform report. Typically, a new Secretary-General sets out his, ideally, it should also be her vision for a 5-year term. And then if re-elected, they have a second report for the second term. So I wrote the report for Kofi's second term. And that was quite an interesting exercise because, you can have, I think in my time, there used to be 45 assistant and another 45 or so, maybe 30 under Secretary-General, but only one report every 5 years. And I got to do that. So it gave me an overview of the system that was very interesting and the support for and opposition to reforms. Most of the opposition came from member states. We were much prepared to be far more radical within the system than member states were prepared to accept. So that's worth remembering too. That was interesting. The most consequential effort I was involved in, which proved successful in the end, was the responsibility to protect, where Gareth Evans and I essentially wrote the report. We provided, if you like, the intellectual leadership in that exercise, and others had senior level political skills and background to support it. Kofi was very much on board and supported it. And it's a rare commission report that within 5 years was written into and codified as a UN principle, which remains relevant today, even if it is on a silent shelf rather than active at the moment. I was also involved in back channels in the creation, in researching and advocating for the creation of G20 as a leaders level movement. This was a small group that we supported from the UN University, and I was directly involved and stayed involved after leaving the UN, a small group in Canada, which we did that. The nuclear issues, I was involved in that, and I continued with that at the ANU when I came back to Australia as director of the Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament. But that is a supporting role. The main leadership on that has been taken by other individuals and organizations, but I was active in that. I think I also had a unique dispensation, literally unique in the entire history of the UN, in that as a senior official, I wrote more than 50 opinion articles in what at the time was the most influential, single most influential newspaper in the world, and that was the International Herald Tribune. condition of my writing was that every article had to state that they were my personal opinion, not the official position, not just of the UN, but even of my institution. And for that to have credibility, a second condition was that none of those articles were actually vetted in advance by the UN, not even read by any other official. They trusted me to get it right. But if something created problems, they wanted the freedom to say it truthfully that they hadn't cleared it, it hadn't been cleared, and it wasn't required to be cleared. It was my personal opinion. I don't think no one else has ever had that dispensation. I doubt that it will be done again, but I got away with it mainly because of Kofi's support. And he appreciated the fact that we as a university were putting ideas on the table that needed to be said. Occasionally, they will be critical of a UN policy. And sometimes he supported it quietly and let me know. Other times he disagreed, but never stopped me, never rebuked me. So that was an important point. And it was important for me. For example, the Iraq War, I opposed it in public as we led up to the war, during it, and after it. I was very critical of that. And indeed, I gave a public lecture in Canberra on the eve of the war. And people said, we assume you have another job lined up. And I didn't at the time. So it was important. So I think I got away with it on many of those things. But there were different times. I think the two really good Secretaries-General the system has had were Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan. And the choice of Secretary-General is another subject to the permanent member's veto. And there are ways of reforming that I think should have been done already, but haven't been done. I think the General Assembly. See, this doesn't require, by the way, a charter amendment. This is an action that the General Assembly can take on its own, and it should have done so already. And that is assert a co-equal role with the Security Council. Not a primary role, but a co-equal role. So one body brings up a short list of 3, and the other body chooses a finalist, and I don't really care which is which. And then they will both have a thing. At the moment, because it's a subject to the veto and the General Assembly has an influencing rather than equal role, the Secretary-General begins from day one conscious of wanting re-election and therefore is far too deferential to the 5 permanent members, fearing a veto in efforts to be re-elected. I prefer a 1 7-year term for this reason. So the Secretary-General is free of the ambition of getting a second term and does that.
And if you're interested, just to interject, the process is underway currently for the selection of the next Secretary-General. So we put some content out on social media recently. I'll drop a link in the chat as well if you want to read more about that. But Gillian, did you get away with it in your time in the UN, as Ramesh seems to have?
Well, in a way I did, because my appointment was quite exceptional. It was very, very rare for somebody like me to be appointed at that level. And I think what I really wanted to say, particularly to younger people thinking about how they could get into the UN system or be part of it and contribute to it, which is what I'd very much like to see. There's no one necessary route. And I deeply believe in getting as much experience as you can in all sorts of areas that could prove to be useful. Interesting in Ramesh's case that he was prepared to write independent pieces in the International Herald Tribune, along bringing doubtless many other skills as well. But interesting that you find ways of getting into the system which aren't sort of a copybook way of doing it. Let me say that I was a public international lawyer. I'd done my PhD on territorial sovereignty, how states acquire territorial sovereignty, and I worked with a major international commercial law firm. But I was then offered the role by the then Attorney General in Australia to be the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And that was at a time, unfortunately, when Australia adopted its policies in relation to refugees, so-called unlawful maritime arrivals, that was egregiously in breach of the Refugee Convention and general norms of international law. And in that role as president, I did what I had presidential statutory powers. I decided to hold an inquiry into the detention of children and their families in offshore islands, Nauru, Manus Island, and Christmas Island, and of course in the detention centres spotted around Australia. The horror was that at that time there were 1,100 children detained without access to education, simply on the grounds that their parents had not got a visa in order to enter Australia. And they were held in truly dreadful circumstances. And we ran a public, under my authority, ran a public inquiry into the condition of those children. And by the time we reported, a good percentage of those children had in fact been released from detention. And I was invited to go to Geneva to see the then High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I remember that he said, what a wonderful report this was on the illegality and horrors of detaining children in these circumstances. And I remember sort of fluttering my feathers with pride at this comment by him until I realized that no country in the world had ever detained 1,100 children as refugees in the country and held them for years without education. So I didn't feel quite so pleased with myself, but nonetheless, of course, colleagues had done much of the hard work. But the point was that brought me to the attention of the United Nations and the Secretary-General. And he then asked me if I would chair another inquiry into the allegations of corruption in UNAIDS, which was doing such remarkable work particularly in Africa, in delivering medicines and managing the medical care of people who had AIDS. So it was an extremely tricky thing to do because the fear was that it would diminish the capacity of UNAIDS to work in the future if the result of our inquiry was to be that they were a corrupted senior management. Now, I won't go into details on that, but the upshot of the inquiry was that all of the senior management retired and resigned from UNAIDS, and a new woman, in fact, was appointed to take over, a marvelous person, and has been there ever since. Now, the point was that brought me a bit into the sort of Secretariat's eyes. And if I had brought any particular skill to it, it was clarity of language. I really found, and maybe Ramesh will agree with me on this, but the UN is somewhat mired in UN language. It's inexplicable to much of the rest of the world and certainly not very inspiring. And I tried to get, even though, of course, the field was largely law and protection, trying to get an expression of using plain English when we write our reports made for a wider public. And I think that led ultimately then to the Secretary-General asking if I would be willing to take on this role, obviously having a background with refugees in UNHCR. So it was very unusual. It wasn't easy to come into the UN as a complete outsider, but it had been a fair process as far as I was aware. But it wasn't easy. In the first year, I think it was rather amusing because I walked into my office, I sat down at the desk, and documents started coming through, and I started doing what lawyers do. I started editing them and correcting them and putting in new thoughts and referring them to other cases or other ideas for refugee policy. And I was quickly advised that was absolutely not my job. My job was to sign those documents and just get on with the business of managing my divisions and managing the huge problems that were emerging as the numbers of refugees, of course, mounted hugely over my time. So I learned the role very quickly. It's essentially a diplomatic role, which is why I tell you the story about my meeting with the president of Zambia, and of course with presidents and ministers of so many countries, nearly 50 countries during my time with UNHCR. So my job was very different than the one I thought it was going to be, and indeed the one I thought I had skills for. But very quickly we literally went from disaster to disaster for refugees. Myanmar, South Sudan, Ethiopia, the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and so on. In many, many parts of the world, the numbers of refugees were exponentially increasing, doubling over 10 years and doubled since in 5. It's been an exponentially massive increase in the movement of peoples. Some of them migrants looking for better opportunities, but my job was, of course, to be concerned about refugees. So it was an extremely interesting time, but I spent a very large amount of my time on planes, going to countries, and spending time in refugee camps. We got, for example, to the Greek islands where many refugees from Turkey were being held one day before COVID broke out. So we were there with with everybody else in the refugee camp. When we finally left, the whole camp was burnt down. Mercifully, nobody was injured. But it was a very, very graphic illustration of just how dangerous refugee camps can be, and how Greece needed to reform its policies, which I might add to a significant degree it has done, despite the rise of a populist movement globally against refugees and migrants, sadly migrants as well. But so that was the journey. It was an extremely interesting one, a desperately sad one, particularly if I can conclude my remarks by reminding us all about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I went up to the area of fighting in North Kivu province, where at that time 6.1 million people had been displaced by civil war, but also by the conflict in North Kivu with M23 and Rwandan troops, allegedly. Always hard to point the finger, but nonetheless a despairing situation where more and more people were being displaced. What was it all about? What's that conflict about? It's about gold and lithium for batteries. And yet there's almost nothing that can be done about it, and very little is done about it. It's such a vicious humanitarian crisis. Now, of course, if anybody was to ask me where I thought the next pandemic or epidemic would emerge, it would be in that region of North Kivu, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that's exactly what's happened. Now, I do hope sincerely that it can be contained, and some African states in particular, Congo, have experience in containing it. But what it's done is to expose not only the realities of that form of conflict in this modern age. What can the UN and peacekeeping forces, if they were ever allowed in, what could they do? But also the danger of not doing anything is that these pandemics become a reality in the modern context. So these are very dangerous times, and times when I really hope that we can see more people understanding not only the negatives about the failures of the UN system, but about the extraordinary work that it does in terms of outcomes for people driven by these kinds of crises in many parts of the world.
Joel, may I add a few things that Gillian said brings back many memories. Firstly, since you're speaking to an audience of young professionals, I would encourage every one of them, if they haven't already done so, to go through any one of these multiple pathways for entry into the system at the earlier stages, and give a preference for working in the field, particularly in developing countries, most certainly including Africa. You will find yourselves in challenging circumstances, sometimes in horrific circumstances, but despite that, you will find it an enriching experience. I would also encourage you, if you go in early and at a relatively junior level, to go in and out of the system rather than stay as a career civil servant just in the system. And go in, come out, and go in at a higher level, maybe, if you can. There are enough of these appointments that are made on a genuine process, on merit, bearing in mind this unavoidable principle of equitable geographical representation in the UN system. But they are worthwhile. And as I said, it's an enriching experience. Now, certainly until the time I left, one other comment, by the way, when I left, and I assume it's the same, Gillian can correct me if it's not, when I left the system 20 years ago, people don't realize up to 80% of refugees were located in neighboring developing countries, not in the Western countries. This is not a problem borne largely by Western countries. This is a problem borne by developing countries who are far less well-resourced and far less capable of handling, but they handle it. So that's worth remembering too. Third thing in the system, under my time, up to the rank below that of Assistant Secretary General, the procedure has fixed rules and application procedures that you go through. Assistant Secretary General and above, depending on the body, in some bodies it is their governing bodies that do that, but the Secretary General can make a personal appointment, provided the post is there, and it's up to the Secretary General's discretion. So there are different things there, but even that for the senior ranks, I used to get any number of requests from counterparts in New York or other parts of the UN system. We are looking to fill a vacancy at this level. Can you recommend someone who you think is good for that? And I think there is an effort made to appoint good people. And Gillian's story of how she ended up is a perfectly good illustration of that. They identify people who are good fit for the UN is trying to do, and bring this element of principled pragmatism, and can try and do good within the limitations of a UN office. So I don't think we should be pessimistic or cynical. I think there's lots to be gained by joining the system or by joining things like the UN Association and trying to influence national policy.
Great plug for us. Thank you. I appreciate it. 15 minutes to go on our allotted time. We could throw to Lily for her next question, and we might try and rapid fire through some of our guests' questions and see how many of the things we wanted to say will get tied into that.
Well, can I just interrupt just very briefly? There's one thing I'd just love to add to what Ramesh has said very quickly. It's an irony that the country that hosts most refugees in the world is Iran, 3 million people. It's quite extraordinary. And he makes this point that the burden, and it is a burden, I was reluctant to use that word originally, but the burden of hosting refugees and providing a humanitarian solution lies overwhelmingly with the poorest or lower income to middle income countries in the world. And it's something that I think we need to digest in Australia before we embark on some of the refugee policies that we continue to maintain. So back to you, Joel.
No,
Thank
back
you.
to Lily.
Yeah, okay, so let's try and do the rapid fire questions and then we'll go to the audience questions. So the first one is, how should Australia navigate calling out hypocrisy and illegality while maintaining core alliances? In your opinion, does one have to take precedence over the other?
Calling out hypocrisy is a dangerous game because we don't recognize our own hypocrisy and we get very angry when others call us out. So if you're prepared to call out hypocrisy, be open to being called out as well. I can't see any future Australian government being open to being called out quite like that, but no other country does either. So it's I think, calling out hypocrisy might make you feel good. It rarely achieves good outcomes.
And then recently, the US Secretary of Defense said that politically correct wars and stupid rules of engagement are not a priority in the Iran war. What are the consequences for American superiority? But more importantly, how can non-combatants be protected when international law isn't a priority?
Gillian can take that. It's her field.
Well, of course, the rules of they're called the rules of international humanitarian law, but of course you're right. The rules of engagement is one part of the language. They emerged from the 19th century, where the slaughter in war and the deaths of civilians was so obvious and so heartbreaking and so useless and cruel that the international community agreed on the Geneva Conventions that led to the creation of international humanitarian law. It is, of course, deeply concerning that any public official, let alone a United States Secretary of Defense, although he has a different word, I think it's the Secretary of War, but we'll put that to one side for the moment, but basically that there's almost no way to take that on other than, and to picking up the point about hypocrisy, there's no point talking about hypocrisy. What I think one has to do is doggedly and keep consistently stating the correct position, both as a matter of law and of morality. That the principle that emerges from millennia is that you attack only military targets, you act with necessity and proportionality, and you do not make civilians a target. And I think you all know the sort of contemporary context for those kinds of issues. They are critical positions of law, not only of 20th century law, but of ancient law. And we need to stand by them. So my approach, and I think Ramesh has said the same thing, that there's no point using words like hypocrisy. I think what you have to do is to keep stating what those rules are and why those rules are important, both as a matter of law, but as a matter of morality and ethics. But also, frankly, of simply managing in this global environment where, as I think you began, Lily, of talking about the interconnected world that we live in. We can't live with unilateral approaches to the might is right approach. We can't do that. We probably never could, but most particularly, we can't do it now.
I think we need to keep pointing out to Americans, and we have to remember that there is wide variety of opinions in the US system. As Gillian said at an earlier point, often the United States has taken leadership on many of these global issues. The development of international humanitarian law has essentially come out of European civilization and European history. Today's world, there are more American soldiers engaged in foreign conflicts than soldiers from any other country. And therefore, it is American soldiers who benefit the most from these protections than the soldiers of any other country. So quietly, I think we need to engage with those sections of the American opinion that recognize that this is something that benefits the soldiers of all countries. And we lose the moral high ground if we abandon the civilized rules of warfare that apply to all countries, that apply even to non-state armed actors and militant groups, and that seek to protect soldiers as well as protect civilians. And those are important principles, and those are principles that have important practical consequences for the protection of our soldiers as well as enemy soldiers.
I think we could have scheduled in an hour for each of these issues because both of you have so much experience that we want to delve into. Thomas asked, does Ramesh think UN officials having more of a say is a way to move away from the politics to hopefully better functioning of the UN, I guess, bureaucracy over the member state power? And Susan has asked, similar to other things, what extent does UN success rely on the passion, skill, networks, drive, etc. of the officials in the system? How they're developed and sustained? So I guess lumping those questions together, and let's see if we can do 30 seconds each for an answer. How does the international system, particularly UN, treat, in broad sense, the workers inside it? Because you both mentioned it takes incredible people to make this machine chug along. How does the UN treat the people inside the network? Does that passion, is it sustained? Is it developed? Is it protected? And do you think those officials, back to Thomas's point, need more to be empowered to do more? And is that a sort of counterweight to the politicization of the member state system? That's a lot. I apologize. 30 seconds each. Gillian first.
Okay, well, I can give you one combined answer to all of that. UN officials are international civil servants. They're not international political actors, neither the equivalent of parliamentarians nor the equivalent of ministers in an executive government. Therefore, they are subject to all sorts of things, including bureaucratic constraints. What is most important in answer to all those questions is the quality of the leader of any department or entity. So for the UNHCR, the most important position is the High Commissioner for Refugees. And he or she sets the tone for the rest of the organization. The same with the Human Rights Council, the same with every other UN entity. And the choice of that, therefore, becomes more important, the most important element. And unfortunately, the P5 have all sorts of mutual back-scratching arrangements. And so the Under-Secretary-General for Peacekeeping, ever since Kofi's time, has been a French person. Political affairs, American. Humanitarian affairs has tended to be British, although that's not always the case. Sometimes it's Japanese. But there's these arrangements. UNICEF has traditionally been American, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to get away from that and go for a much more genuine leave the Secretary-General the option of going for the best person, and overall look at an equitable geographical representation rather than this senior post is limited to this particular country. I think that would be the way forward on that.
Gillian, how's the UN treat its execs, its staff, its volunteers, its workers? Is it a nice, productive, supportive environment?
Oh, I think so. But the quality of those officials is extremely high, and they are across whether you're dealing with the World Food Programme or an environmental programme, or in my case with refugee staff, they are in the UN system because they deeply believe in the purposes of the UN and in the work that they're doing. And that really struck me, partly because many of them have worked their way up the system. They've been with the UN for a very long time, but that's changing as new people come in. I think the employment environment is a very healthy one, but, and this is a big but now, with the massive decrease in funding that I've mentioned, and the Secretary General mentioned it as existentially threatening, it's been hugely troubling that the budgets for UNHCR, for the other major agencies, has declined so much that those staff are now are losing their positions in very, very significant numbers. So we're losing a lot of wisdom and commitment to the purposes of the UN. I think so without the money, they cannot rebuild. So we have to come back to my point about pragmatism. There's no money. The money isn't there. And people are losing their jobs, and they're trying to find work in other humanitarian fields, often at the national level. So at the moment, it's a particularly distressing time.
Well said, thank you. Question from Kieran, and I think we've all touched on this a little bit in our remarks, in particularly Ramesh's UN 2.0 plan. Kieran wants to know how we can better democratize the UN, given the unequal power of larger countries through their influence, etc., and the inequality between, Security Council vetoes and General Assembly, etc., as mentioned. I guess 30 seconds each. Do you have any bright ideas, reasons for hope about how greater democratization can support UN reforms, or anything you'd like to add to previous remarks?
Well, democratization in the UN context means one country, one vote. It doesn't mean one person, one vote. If you democratize by population weight, then you'll have China and India and Indonesia and Brazil and Nigeria, the dominant countries. That's not going to happen. But at the moment, you got a choice between the geopolitical logic of the Security Council composition and the one country, one vote democracy logic of General Assembly. And the challenge is how to make these two main organs work better and link up with the World Court and the International Criminal Court as well.
Yes, I think the doable part of all of that is to increase the size of the Security Council and bring in more of the major countries. It's a smallish step, but it's an important one. I think the other point that I'd like to make is I was always so disappointed that after what was called the Uniting for Peace resolution in 1950 by the General Assembly, it looked as though Ramesh's vision of sort of equal partners with the Security Council and the General Assembly, we might be able to have a stronger role for the General Assembly. That has not actually happened. And so there's been a failure as well, I believe, in the General Assembly. They've not been able to step up and to really make their position clear. And I think that would have given us a greater sense of a more open and democratic process, respecting the rights of sovereign states. But in fact, it's shifted to a focus on the Security Council and then hit a brick wall because the Security Council is now being sidelined and not able to play the role that we would expect it to play in its primary function under the United Nations Charter. That really has failed.
Yeah, interesting. The last question on my list is from Susan, and I might tie this one into the last question we always ask, which is shamelessly, why, how should people, young professionals particularly, get involved in the system, what the value is, and what your one key takeaway is for young professionals listening tonight. Susan's question is about the ICG climate case. I assume she means Vanuatu is highly likely. Will that case stimulate other interests of young people driving change through the General Assembly? What can we learn from that case? So I want to bundle that into what your advice is, and this is probably the closing question at 7:29. Reflections on that case being a call to action for other young people around the world. And what would you say in your closing, 30 seconds to young people watching tonight and who will see this later online on social media about why we should have hope and why Lily was wrong in her provocation?
I think it touches or builds on something that Gillian has said repeatedly, which I fully and heartily endorse. And that is, for all the young people, this is about your future. This is your world. Gillian and I are both emeritus. We are extinguished rather than distinguished people now. It's for you to either go into opposition mode and protest about things, or to engage with the process, seek to understand it, come to grips with it, and then make it work to your ends and your visions and your needs. Because we are getting more, not less, interconnected. Borders are becoming less meaningful in shaping our lives. And we either, the old saying, we either cooperate together or we all hang together. It is very true. It's getting more volatile, more unpredictable, more dangerous. Typically, major new initiatives in world organizations have come at the end of a world war. Given today's destructive weapons of mass destruction, we cannot afford that traditional route to major innovations and creations in order to institutionalize cooperation and conflict muting and conflict resolution. There is no substitute for that effort. It doesn't mean it necessarily has to be tied to the existing structures and personnel. If you can't reform, replace it, if that becomes easier. But something like the United Nations will continue to be needed. It's indispensable. It is a recognition that our fates are tied together, and it's for you to make sure that that fate is better rather than worse. We've done our bit for better or worse, but it's up to you.
Excellent answer. Gillian, can you top that?
Well, no, I certainly can't top it, but I can say that I'd say for young people, you are the future and you can be and are the leaders for that future. And I think you should grasp that and become engaged. And it doesn't matter at what level and how. It could be you want to support a Human Rights Act in Australia. It might be that you want to work in the environmental field, or you want to work for a charity. I think take opportunities, take risks, but take opportunities. You will not get rich. You will not necessarily go to the top of your profession. But you will if you have a clear idea of what you see as the importance of our interconnectedness globally. If you have that clear in your mind, you can truly make a difference. But to persevere and finally get your facts right and be measured in the way in which you go about promoting and advocating for the things that you believe in. And I know I can say you will lead personally a much more enriched and meaningful life, and you will be helpful in creating this new world that we're definitely going to be seeing in the next few years.
Thank you both so much for your time. It's been a very enlightening conversation and a good outcome that, yes, while there are challenges, it's not all over. I'll throw to Joel now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Past and
you.
present Assistant Under Secretary Generals. Thank you all to our excellent speakers. We really appreciate the time you've taken to be with us here tonight. We do really appreciate it. If you're interested in staying in touch with us, either through events or through volunteering, we always have spots available. We have teams across the country. So look at our website, unaayp.org.au, and LinkedIn and Instagram are both very active as well. And we look forward to staying engaged. So Lily, Ramesh, Gillian, thank you so much again for your time. And we'd love to wish everybody online a lovely evening. Thank you very much.